Welcome to Calm History for Sleep. Take a deep breath. Let the tension in your shoulders melt away. With every word, we'll guide you gently through forgotten paths of time-quiet moments where history meets tranquility. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts drift like slow-moving clouds, and allow yourself to sink into a story told softly, with care. You are safe here, in the calm glow of the past, far from the thunder of cannons and the glory of coronations. The island of St. Helena was not merely a prison, it was a stage for reflection. In this quiet corner of the South Atlantic, surrounded by steep cliffs and the constant whisper of wind across the rocks, the once mighty emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, found himself exiled, not only from his empire, but from the world he once commanded. The mornings on the island were slow and moist with mist. They rolled in from the ocean like an eternal sigh, dampening the wild grass and softening the contours of everything. The house he inhabited, Longwood, was a plain, DAMP structure not fit for an emperor, but just suitable for a man who had traded destiny for silence. Each morning, Napoleon would rise slowly. The stiffness in his joints was no longer the ache of battle-worn fatigue, but the creeping touch of time. No aides-de-camp rushing in, no roaring crowds, no scribbled messages from the front. Only the creaking wood of his chamber and the dull scrape of boots across the hallway outside. He would dress slowly, with a deliberateness he had never permitted himself as a general. At times, he gazed into the distance through a narrow window, as though hoping to see France once again. But only the sea replied. Its vastness mocked his memories, and the waves brought not messages from Paris, but only birds and the occasional ship that never stopped. Yet, amid the monotony of exile, Napoleon was not consumed by bitterness alone. He began to write. At first, it was mere dictation military campaigns, memoirs of battles, reflections on strategy. But in the quietest hours, something else stirred. He drafted the beginnings of a novel, a love story. The plot was simple, almost childlike in its purity. A soldier falls in love with a woman far above his station. War separates them. Misunderstandings wound their trust. Years pass. He returns not as a hero, but a weary man, only to find her married and fading from the world. This story, though fictional, was not entirely removed from the marrow of his experience. In his youth, before the weight of a crown, Napoleon had adored letters. He had once written clumsy, passionate notes to Josephine, words more full of yearning than command. It was this youthful flame, once thought extinguished by power and war, that now flickered back to life on the edge of the known world. As he wrote, the lines between history and imagination blurred. His characters bore the names of strangers, but he knew their hearts intimately. He gave them the words he wished he had said, the forgiveness he never sought, the endings he never found. There were no editors to critique, no readers to applaud, only silence. And that, perhaps, was what he needed most. Evenings fell slowly on St. Helena. The air turned cool, the sky a watercolor of fading pastels. And in those hushed hours, the former emperor, now merely a man, would sit by a flickering candle and write page after page, not about battles or treaties, but about longing, regret, and tenderness. In exile, Napoleon found no throne, no return, no redemption in history books, but he found a voice, a quiet human one. And in the solitude of St. Helena, he finally listened to it. Before the world quieted, before the years settled upon him like dust, Napoleon Bonaparte was a man of dispatches, a master of declarations, commands, and treaties. But here, On this small, windswept island, where the sea spoke louder than men, his words softened. He began to write letters, not to generals or diplomats, but to phantoms, to memories, to those who once stirred something in his heart. The first was addressed to no one. Its parchment bore no name, but its tone was unmistakable. It was for Josephine. You once told me that silence between two souls can be more powerful than the noisiest embrace. Tonight, I understand that. I speak to you in silence now. The lines were brief, uneven, like breaths drawn between waking and sleep. He folded the page, laid it gently in the drawer beside his bed, and stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic tap of rain on the shutters. Each letter that followed carried less of a need to explain and more of a desire to remember. There were notes to his son lines written as though the boy were walking beside him through the hills of St. Helena, asking questions in a voice he could barely recall. "What is bravery, Papa?" Napoleon imagined him saying. "It is to wait, my child, to stand still when your soul trembles to run." He wrote to Lucien, his brother, recalling a summer day in Corsica when the two had fished in silence and returned with empty hands, laughing. He wrote to his mother of the scent of rosemary and warm bread. He even wrote to a gardener he once saw planting tulips in the Tuileries, admiring the quiet joy in a life rooted to the earth. But these letters were never meant to be read. He did not seal them. He did not send them. They lived in hidden folds of paper and thought, collected in a wooden box he kept beneath his desk. Sometimes he read them aloud, softly, as if speaking to the sea. "Forgive me," he once murmured, though he did not say to whom. He was not writing history. He was not building legacy. He was remembering how to be human. Each evening, before extinguishing the lamp, he would write one line, a practice, a ritual, a farewell. "If anyone remembers me," he once scribbled, "may it be not for the battles I won, but for the words I never dared to say." And then he slept, the box of letters beside him filled not with records of empire, but with the quiet echoes of the man who had lived behind the crown. In the early days of his exile, Napoleon wandered through the overgrown paths of Longwood's gardens. There were no roses there, no orderly hedges or fountains like those in the palatial grounds of Malmaison. Instead, he found patches of wild thyme and tufts of wind-blown grass scattered like lost thoughts. It was a place of rough beauty, unmanicured, untouched by imperial hands, yet utterly sincere in its stillness. Welcome again to calm history for sleep. Breathe in slowly. Let your body grow heavy and your thoughts begin to settle, like dust on a forgotten windowsill. We are traveling through time not to recall conquests, but to remember quiet moments, the ones that history books often ignore. This is your space to drift gently into sleep, guided by the soft murmurs of a man who once ruled continents, but now walked barefoot through memory. Napoleon's steps in the garden were slow and almost reverent. He wore no military regalia here, only a plain coat and boots worn from pacing. He had asked for seeds to be brought from Europe, hoping to build a proper garden, but most withered before blooming. The soil resisted, much like the stubborn hearts he had once tried to conquer. And so, he planted little by little not plants, but thoughts. Lines of imagined prose, fragments of half-formed characters, scenes he would revisit at night with pen in hand. Sometimes he imagined the garden blooming, not with flowers, but with memories. Each step would evoke a different time. A lilac bush might carry the perfume of Josephine's hair. A broken branch might crack like musket fire at Austerlitz. The rustle of dry grass could echo a whisper from his youth, long buried under layers of ambition. There were times when he sat on a stone bench at the far edge of the path and simply watched the wind play in the grass. His mind, no longer storming with strategies, wandered like a child tracing shadows. And it was there, in that small, forgotten corner of the island, that he dreamed of creating something no army could build, a story that bloomed without permission. He began writing more frequently at this time, not just the romantic tragedy that whispered in his mind, but sketches of entire chapters. A fictional duel between friends, a betrayal that mirrored his own disappointments. He wasn't writing for posterity or propaganda. He was writing to release something inside him, like a bird tapping on a window pane, desperate to be let out. But the garden, too, became a metaphor. He started seeing his characters as seeds. Some were buried too deeply in pride to ever sprout. Others needed light he wasn't sure he still carried. But he planted them anyway, line after line, letting the soil of imagination receive what it would. One afternoon, after a soft rain, he knelt in the garden, not as an emperor or general, but as a man looking for signs of life. He found a single sprout pushing through the earth. He brushed the soil gently and smiled. It wasn't much, but it was real. And perhaps, he thought, that's all a writer needs. By now, the staff had grown used to his solitary rituals. They no longer questioned the parchment scraps tucked into his coat or the way he would pause mid-sentence, lost in a world no one else could see. He was building in silence, a sanctuary of narrative, a garden of stories no war could burn. Evenings in the garden were particularly poignant. As twilight deepened, the world seemed to blur. The sharp edges of regret softened. The burdens of history faded under the hush of dusk. And he would whisper imagined dialogue to the shadows' lines that would never be read, characters that would never breathe, but stories that healed nonetheless. And when the stars emerged, faint and trembling above the Atlantic, Napoleon would rise slowly and return to Longwood. In his wake, the garden remained a quiet partner to his thoughts. It didn't need to bloom. It only needed to be there, just like his stories. There were mornings when the air on St. Helena tasted faintly of salt and wood smoke, drifting in from distant hearths and the restless sea. The sky above Longwood would paint itself in soft grays and dull blues, a canvas not of storm or sunshine, but of in-between. On such days, Napoleon often remained indoors, seated near the broad window of his modest writing room. From this vantage, he could see the hills rolling away like gentle waves, and the occasional flicker of movement goats, perhaps, or a servant's silhouette vanishing into the mist. This was not a place of grandeur. The walls bore no gilded frames, no echoes of court laughter. Only the quiet tick of a clock and the scratch of his pen disturbed the hush. The desk was plain, worn smooth by hours of use, and the ink dried unevenly on the page, depending on the mood of the weather. But for all its simplicity, this space had become a refuge, a small chamber where he could set aside the weight of exile and let his imagination unfold. He had rearranged the room many times, searching for the perfect balance between light and silence. He moved the desk closer to the window when he wanted to feel the warmth of the sun on his hands, and farther into the corner on days when the memories weighed more heavily. On the wall beside him hung a small map of Europe, faded and curling at the edges. He rarely looked at it, though. It reminded him not of victories, but of the vastness of what had been lost. The wind sometimes crept in through the shutters, carrying with it a scent of ocean salt and rain-soaked earth. It would lift the edge of a manuscript or ruffle the corner of a book, as if reminding him that the world still turned, still breathed, even without him at its helm. On those days, he felt both comforted and haunted by nature's indifference. There were notebooks stacked in uneven piles on the floor, some filled with careful sketches of characters lovers separated by time, revolutionaries disillusioned by power, young men chasing ideals they barely understood. Others held passages written in a rush, as if he were afraid the thought might vanish before the ink met the paper. These fragments were not polished, not fit for publication, but they were sincere. They held the warmth of a man who had nothing left to prove, only something left to say. He often wrote late into the evening. As candlelight flickered across the walls, he would lose himself in the quiet rhythm of the pen, the soft scratch a companion more loyal than most who had surrounded him in his youth. His breathing would slow, his shoulders relax, and for a few fleeting hours, he was not Napoleon the Emperor, but simply a man reflecting, remembering, dreaming. On the coldest nights, when the fire struggled to keep the damp at bay, he would pull a wool blanket tight around his shoulders and continue writing with gloved hands. The ink froze in its bottle more than once. He would hold it close to the flame, watching it thaw drop by drop. Even that act felt symbolic, a slow return of something dormant, a flicker of life in the silence. He rarely spoke of what he was writing. The few times he mentioned it to the staff, it was with a half smile, as though sharing a secret that could not be understood. When asked if it was a memoir, he would shake his head. "Not of my life," he'd murmur. "Of lives I never lived." There was one particular story he returned to again and again, a tale of a young, Corsican boy who dreamed of the stars, but was bound by duty. He wrote it not as a tragedy, but as a meditation. In his telling, the boy never became a conqueror. He remained on the island, tending to olive trees, writing poems to the moon, loved deeply and simply. The story had no climax, no war, no betrayal. Only quiet moments, only peace. He rewrote the ending of that story a dozen times. Sometimes the boy would grow old and die alone under the same tree where he had written his first verse. Other times he would vanish into the hills, becoming a legend whispered by shepherds. But always, the story ended with silence, a soft return to the earth, like a breath exhaled and forgotten. Napoleon never finished the tale. It did not need an ending. The writing room bore witness to all of it. And long after the ink dried, after the pen rested, the air remained thick with untold stories, drifting like ghosts between the pages. Outside, the sea whispered still. It was in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world held its breath between darkness and light, that Napoleon would often find himself wandering the narrow corridors of Longwood House. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his slippers, not in protest, but in weary familiarity, as if they too remembered better days. He walked without urgency, trailing his fingers along the faded wallpaper, stopping now, and then to gaze through the small windows, where the stars hung like lanterns in a sleeping sky. He had come to know the house intimately. Each room carried its own silence, its own scent, its own echo. There was the library, where dust coated forgotten volumes like a second skin. The dining room, where empty chairs stood like statues in mourning. And the bedroom he no longer slept in, where the sheets remained tucked and the hearth had gone cold. These spaces were not haunted by ghosts, but by stillness, a deeper, quieter presence that settled into the corners and stayed. Tonight, The air was damp and cool. A storm had passed during the evening, leaving behind the scent of wet wood and clean earth. The candles he carried trembled slightly in their holders, casting gentle shadows that followed him like memories too timid to speak. He paused in front of a small table, tucked into an alcove beneath the stairs. Upon it sat a worn leather journal, its corners curled with age. He opened it without thought, as one might open a window, and the pages offered him fragments, phrases, sketches, half-finished paragraphs. One passage caught his eye. The soul does not crave victory. It craves meaning. He traced the words with his fingertip, and closed the book gently and continued on. There was something about the night that invited honesty. In the stillness, stripped of uniforms and ceremony, he could admit to himself the truths he had long hidden behind titles and commands. He was tired, not just in body, but in spirit. And yet, in this exhaustion, he found a strange kind of clarity, as if the fog of ambition had finally lifted, revealing something softer beneath. He entered the old salon, where the curtains swayed slightly despite the closed windows. Here, he sat in a low chair and let his mind drift. He remembered a time in his youth when he believed in destiny with unshakable certainty, when the stars had seemed like messengers, and every step felt like fate. Now he wondered if perhaps it had all been a long detour, a brilliant, blinding loop that led him back to himself. He spoke aloud, not expecting an answer. What would I write if I had no past to explain? The room, as always, listened in silence. As he lingered in the dim light, he noticed how the candle flames wavered not from wind, but from the quiet movement of his breath. Even that seemed significant now. Each exhalation a small surrender, each inhalation a fragile insistence that he was still here, still thinking, still dreaming. He thought about the novel he had begun months ago, tucked away in the desk drawer of his study. It was not a grand tale. It had no wars, no emperors, no sweeping battles for glory. Instead, it followed the life of a bookseller in a coastal village, a man who spent his days sorting through forgotten volumes and his nights writing letters he never sent. The story moved slowly, like waves brushing the shore, steady, quiet, and without urgency. In this story, the bookseller fell in love with a woman who never appeared in person. Only in the letters she sent the wrong address. He replied anyway, pretending to be the intended recipient, weaving a gentle fiction that gradually became his truth. Their correspondence grew into something sacred, not romantic in the usual sense, but deeply intimate. An exchange of thoughts, regrets, hopes. Two invisible people building a world out of words. Napoleon had written page after page of these imagined letters, each one a reflection of his own unanswered questions. In the bookseller's solitude, he found echoes of his own. In the stranger's quiet longing, he uncovered pieces of what he had once believed he no longer felt. Sometimes he thought of sending the manuscript to someone, perhaps a friend still loyal, or a former confidant. But each time the idea came, it was followed by silence. The book was not for others. It was his lantern in the dark. The night deepened. Outside, rain began again, tapping softly against the window panes. The sound was steady and soothing, like the slow turning of pages. He stood and crossed to the hearth, where only a few coals remained glowing. He added a log with careful hands, watching as the fire came back to life in small, tentative flickers. The warmth spread gently through the room, and with it came the faint scent of pine. He closed his eyes, letting the moment settle over him. It felt like a dream won, not of triumph or loss, but of quiet endurance. A man no longer powerful, simply existing within the space he had come to know better than any battlefield. In this house, in these halls walked not an emperor, but a man slowly learning to listen again to the creaks in the floor, the hum of the wind, the quiet rhythm of his own heart. And in the silence, he wrote. The sun rose slowly over St. Helena, brushing the mist with a soft golden hue. But within the quiet walls of Longwood, morning was not a thing to be welcomed. It was simply another shade of silence. Napoleon sat at the far end of the garden, where a wooden bench had been placed between two wind-sculpted trees. The air was cool, fragrant with dew, and faintly touched by the distant sea. Birds stirred gently in the branches overhead, not with song, but with a delicate rustle of wings unfurling from sleep. He carried with him a blanket, thick and rough, which he wrapped around his shoulders as he settled into the seat. On his lap rested a notebook, one of many he had begun and abandoned. This one, however, bore a different purpose. It was not a journal, not a record of events or grievances, but a garden of sentences, loose and scattered like fallen leaves. Each entry began with a dream. He had started documenting his dreams after noticing how they lingered longer now, even hours after waking. They were different than the dreams of his youth, not bold, not grand, but tender. They unfolded not in marble palaces or across battlefields, but in bakeries, in orchards, in sunlit rooms with windows open to spring air. There was one dream, in particular, that had returned several times. In it, he was a young man again, faceless and free of name. He lived in a cottage surrounded by lavender fields, spent his days repairing old books, and his nights listening to the wind whispering through the leaves. No wars, no burdens, just time and earth. He wrote the dream down again now, adjusting it with each memory that surfaced. He lingered on the details, the scent of ink and dried herbs, the way the floor creaked near the back door, the sound of rain hitting the roof like soft applause. These details mattered. They were the evidence of another self, a parallel life where peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of something gentler. He paused and closed his eyes, breathing deeply, allowing the air to fill the quiet chambers within him. For a moment, he let go of the idea of identity, of legacy, of history. He was simply a man on a bench in the early light of day, writing down the contours of a life imagined so vividly it ached. The garden itself was modest, but carefully tended. A few flowering bushes lined the path, their blossoms pale and trembling in the breeze. The grass was uneven in places, wild in others, but he preferred it that way. Order had its place on maps and in treaties, but here, in the breath between days, he welcomed disorder. It felt more human, more alive. In the distance, a servant moved quietly between rooms, beginning the rituals of the day. The clink of porcelain, the faint creak of a door. These were the new drums of his world, their rhythms slow and soft. And while the world beyond the sea carried on, oblivious, he sat here listening to the silence between each sound. He opened the notebook again and began writing a letter to no one. It began, "If I had been born a gardener, I might have written poems instead of proclamations." He paused, then added, "But perhaps the earth and I were not strangers after all." He did not sign the letter. He never did. Instead, he turned the page and continued with a new line. "Today, I saw a bird land near the lavender, its wings the color of smoke. It watched me without fear. I wonder if it sees me differently than men do." Perhaps it does not see a name or a crown or a weight carried too long. Perhaps it sees a man who breathes. And that is enough. The writing flowed gently now, like water finding its path. He wrote of memories that never happened, conversations that never took place, and places he had never seen. Yet they felt more real, sometimes, than the parades and ceremonies that had filled his former life. He wrote of a woman who made honey from wildflowers and told stories to children on warm summer nights. Of a village where no one asked about the past and where the future was measured in the flowering of trees. Of a boy who followed fireflies and found, in their brief light, something close to joy. These were not stories of escape. They were offerings, pieces of himself that had never found breath in the world of politics and war. He lingered on the image of that woman, her hands stained by pollen, her voice a melody of comfort in the twilight. He imagined her walking barefoot through the grass, stopping to speak with birds, humming to the rhythm of bees. It was as if the entire village existed within her breath, a breath that never demanded, only gave. Napoleon leaned back, the wood of the bench firm against his shoulders. The lavender scent had grown richer under the growing sun, curling around his senses like a lullaby. He drifted into a waking dream, one where he strolled through that imagined village as a stranger, greeted not with reverence, but with kindness. There, his past did not precede him. Only his presence mattered. He saw himself sharing bread with a farmer, sitting in silence beside a pond, watching dragonflies weave their delicate patterns, listening to a child describe the shapes in the clouds as though each one held a secret. No speeches, no ceremonies, just hours that unfolded like petals, each moment a soft revelation. When the wind picked up, it rattled the notebook's pages. He reached to close it, but paused, his fingers resting on the soft parchment. The pages felt warm from the sun, alive in a quiet way. He imagined them growing roots, reaching down into the earth of his imagination, anchoring something real and human. He whispered, as if to the wind, "I wish I had known sooner that the gentlest lives leave the deepest roots." The garden, alive with its modest symphony of insects and rustling leaves, seemed to agree. And for a long time, he remained there, a quiet man beneath the trees, cradling his silence like a forgotten heirloom finally found. And still he breathed, and still the dreams came. The morning fog clung softly to the hills above Longwood House, as if reluctant to release its gentle embrace on the landscape. Each blade of grass shimmered with dew, catching the pale light like 1,000 tiny lanterns. In the early hush, broken only by the distant caw of seabirds and the rustle of damp leaves, Napoleon stirred from sleep, not with haste, but with the quiet resignation of one who had long since ceased to mark the days. He rose and dressed slowly, the fabric of his worn coat whispering against itself as he moved. The act had become ritual, not necessity. There were no councils to attend, no battalions to command, no envoys awaiting audience. Still, he smoothed the sleeves with practiced care and straightened the collar before stepping outside. The world met him with silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the rhythmic creak of a weathered gate swinging idly on its hinges. The landscape before him had changed little over the years, a gentle sprawl of hills and scattered trees, the sea always present in the distance, like a secret never far from the tongue. He walked without purpose, but not without thought. His steps carried him to a familiar clearing behind the house, where a stone bench waited, its surface cool and pitted with age. There he sat, folded his hands, and stared at the sky. Thin clouds drifted slowly overhead, unburdened and indifferent. It was in this place, with his thoughts drifting like the clouds above, that a new idea had taken root in recent weeks. A story, not a memoir, not a confession, but something imagined. A novel, fiction. It had begun as idle thought, a passing fancy during a particularly long and stormy afternoon. But it had grown, quietly persistent, like ivy curling around stone. The story, in his mind, followed a modest tailor in an unnamed French village. The man lived a quiet life, unnoticed and content. He measured fabric and listened more than he spoke. He knew every wrinkle in every coat, every hand that wore them. The tailor had a secret, of course, one all good stories must carry. His secret was a book, hidden in a drawer, filled with letters he had never sent, written to a woman whose name he had long since forgotten, but whose voice he remembered like a lullaby. Napoleon wrote about him in the evenings, hunched over his desk with a candle burning low. He had filled pages with descriptions of the tailor's shop, the dust motes that danced in sunbeams, the creak of the wooden floor, the smell of wool and lavender. It brought him comfort, this imaginary world. It was a place where nothing was expected of him, where no decisions led to war, where a man's legacy was measured not in marble, but in the way he hemmed a sleeve. Sometimes he questioned why the idea had taken such hold. Perhaps it was because the story offered him a kind of freedom he had never known. Or perhaps, more simply, it was the act of creation, the shaping of something gentle, something unburdened by the weight of history. He smiled faintly as he imagined the tailor speaking with a boy from the village, showing him how to thread a needle. The boy would laugh. The tailor would pretend to be stern, and together they would mend a coat passed down through 3 generations. It was in such small acts that Napoleon found solace now. He returned to the house and opened his writing desk. The manuscript, bound loosely with string, was already thick with pages. He added to it carefully, the quill moving with unusual softness, as if he feared disturbing the quiet world he had created. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, but inside, the candle's flame stood firm. As he wrote, he imagined the tailor's final day. Not dramatic, not tragic. Just a quiet evening, a shared cup of tea, the ticking of a clock. And then sleep, the kind that comes without fear or memory. He paused and dipped the quill again, whispering aloud, "Let him have peace. Let him rest in the place I never found." And as ink met paper once more, Napoleon understood something. He was not writing to entertain, nor to be remembered. He was writing to forgive himself. And in the quiet hours that followed, as the rain returned to tap gently at the window pane, the emperor wrote on, not of conquest, not of exile, but of a tailor and a village, and a peace that, if not his own, might belong to someone. Someone, someday, who needed a story to fall asleep to. The afternoon light spilled through the narrow windows of Longwood. House in warm, slanted beams, gilding the wooden floorboards and turning dust into drifting specks of gold. Napoleon stood by the window for a long while, his hand resting gently against the frame. Outside, the wind tugged lazily at the tall grasses, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and soft across the lawn, as if even they had grown tired of standing upright. He had spent the morning in stillness, more inward than out, Not reading, not writing, but simply existing within the gentle rhythm of passing hours. It was during these quiet spans of time that his mind turned not to what had been, but to what never was. Dreams, not of glory or strategy, but of other lives, quieter lives, as if they were folded neatly within him all along. One of those dreams returned to him now. It was always the same. He was a bookseller in a sleepy coastal town, his shop nestled between a bakery and a florist, with the scent of warm bread and crushed petals mingled in the salty air. He would open his shutters each morning to the sound of waves and laughter, and spend his days arranging titles by mood rather than alphabet, speaking softly with strangers who became familiar over time. He would recommend a novel to an old widow with kind eyes, and she would return days later with her cheeks flushed and her spirit lighter. He would keep a cup of tea warming on the stove and hum forgotten melodies as he dusted the shelves. Sometimes he would pause and read a passage aloud, not for anyone, just for the pleasure of hearing language dance in the air. In this dream, he never once spoke of politics. No one ever asked where he had come from or what he had done. His past did not follow him there, and the only battles he fought were with stubborn cobwebs in the corners of high shelves. He walked slowly back to his writing desk, fingers trailing along the edge of the table as if stirring thoughts to life. He opened his leather-bound journal, not the manuscript of the tailor's story, but the other one, the one that held fragments. Dreams, alternate selves. It was not meant for publication. It was meant for peace. He wrote, "Today I returned to the bookshop. The yellow cat was asleep in the window again, curled among the poetry volumes. I did not disturb him. A girl came, in looking for a story about forgiveness. I gave her the one I never finished writing. She thanked me with her silence. The words emerged slowly, each one placed with care, like stones across a river. He was building a path across something wide and deep, not time, not memory, but the distance between who he had been and who he could have become." He paused, closing his eyes. The sound of the wind brushing against the house reminded him of sails, and for a moment he was at sea, not as a general, but as a passenger, watching the horizon blur. He imagined a voyage with no destination, only motion. He imagined never arriving, never being recognized, never needing to explain. Just sky and waves, and sleep beneath the stars. He opened his eyes again and returned to the page. "I have learned," he wrote, "that a quiet afternoon can hold more truth than a lifetime of speeches. That the scent of rain on stone can speak, louder than applause. That there is power in choosing stillness." His hand trembled slightly, and he set the pen down. In the silence that followed, he listened not for voices, not for footsteps, but for the hush that exists when nothing is required of you. He had once stood before thousands and heard cheers. Now, he sat alone and heard only the rustle of trees. And yet, this quiet moved him more deeply. He returned to the dream of the bookshop. In it, he would close early on Thursdays, take a slow, walk down to the harbor, and sit on the stone wall with a notebook in hand. He never wrote much, only fragments. The color of a passerby's scarf, the sound of boots on wet cobblestone, the way the light lingered just a moment longer on the face of someone lost in thought. He imagined running into an old friend there. They wouldn't recognize each other at first. They would speak of the weather, of the fish market, of a novel they both enjoyed. only after parting with the friend pause, turn back, and wonder, but not ask. Some things were better left unnamed. He smiled at the thought. Then, a breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying the scent of the sea. He closed the journal, and simply sat, not as a writer, not as an emperor, not even as a man with regrets, but as a soul at rest, however briefly. And in that moment, all of Longwood seemed to exhale with him. The house, the hills, the sea beyond it all folded around him like a blanket stitched from memory and imagination. And within it, he dreamed again of the bookshop, of Thursday evenings, and of stories that asked for nothing but to be heard in the stillness of the heart. Someone who would understand that even emperors dream of ordinary lives. The evening crept gently over the grounds of Longwood House, wrapping the landscape in muted lavender and quiet gold. The birds had fallen silent, their songs replaced by the soft rustling of leaves stirred by a tender breeze. Napoleon sat beneath the veranda, his hands clasped in his lap, a woolen shawl draped over his shoulders, though the air was mild. The day had not been tiring, nor eventful, but his body ached as if echoing the weariness of memory rather than effort. His thoughts drifted again to the imagined lives he had begun collecting like stones, smooth, round, heavy with meaning. Today, the life he returned to was neither of a tailor nor bookseller, but something quieter still, a lighthouse keeper. He imagined a solitary tower perched on a rocky cliff, the sea roaring far below. In this life, he woke before dawn, lit the beacon with practiced hands, and walked the spiral staircase with steady steps. There was no urgency in his tasks, only constancy. Each day mirrored the one before, and yet no two waves that crashed below were ever quite the same. He tended to the machinery with care, oiling gears, replacing worn rope, polishing the lens with a cloth he had sewn from an old shirt. Meals were simple bread, salted fish, a stew made from root vegetables, and taken with a view of the endless horizon. He read by candlelight, journals filled with entries about the color of the sea, the flight of birds, the scent of coming storms. Occasionally, a ship would pass. He would signal them, sometimes with light, sometimes with flags, always with a sense of invisible communion. They did not know his name, nor he theirs, but in that fleeting exchange was a mutual recognition. We are here. We are alive. We are moving forward. Napoleon wrote slowly in his journal, capturing fragments of this life. Today the sea was quieter than I expected. I sat by the rocks and watched the tide kiss the shore and retreat again, reluctant. I wrote a letter to no one and sealed it in a bottle. I do not know what I said. Perhaps that is best. He lingered over the page, imagining the bottle drifting, far from his imagined shore, carried by the ocean's secret currents. Would it ever be found? Would someone read it in a different world, at a different time, and understand? As twilight deepened, the lamplight from inside cast a golden halo around the veranda. He rose and walked slowly to the threshold, but did not yet cross. Instead, he stood still, listening to the hum of the island night. Crickets whispered in the grass. The scent of wood smoke lingered faintly in the air. He thought of how, in the lighthouse dream, he sometimes wrote poems, short ones, always about light or loss, or both. He whispered one now, the words shaping themselves softly in the hush. A single flame against the dark, a rhythm in the wind, a voice that keeps repeating, begin again. Begin. He smiled, the lines lingering like warmth in his chest. Not brilliant, not clever, but true. And that was enough. Returning inside, he lit a small oil lamp and placed it on his writing desk. The flame danced gently, its flicker reflected in the ink bottle beside it. He sat and began to write once more. He wrote of storms, the kind that come without warning, and the kind that rumble on the horizon for days before they reach you. He wrote of nights when the sea seemed to vanish, shrouded in thick mist, and how in those moments the keeper trusted the rhythm of the waves more than his own eyes. He wrote of mornings when the sun rose so quietly it felt like forgiveness. He paused often, letting the silence fill the spaces between thoughts. In that silence, he sometimes heard echoes not of cannon or shouts, but of waves, gulls, and the creak of the lighthouse stairs. Then he added a line to the journal. I think the light was never meant for ships. It was meant for me, to remember who I am, where I am, and that I still exist in this world, even if no one is watching. He closed the journal slowly, his fingers resting on its cover. The night had deepened outside, and the stars began to appear, each one arriving, without ceremony. He stepped outside once more, looking up at the vast dome of the sky. In another life, he thought, I might have guided travelers safely through storms. In this one, I only hope to guide myself gently through the dark. The breeze picked up slightly, brushing against his face with a softness that reminded him of childhood, of linens drying in the Corsican sun, of distant laughter, of days before titles and treaties. He stood there for a long while, beneath the stars, neither waiting nor wishing, but simply being. And far within, in the quiet harbor of his imagination, the lighthouse stood tall, its beacon steady, casting light not outward but inward. And it was enough. It was finally enough. The sky over Longwood shifted gently from ink to obsidian, the last traces of twilight absorbed by the deepening night. Inside the quiet chamber, the flicker of an oil lamp painted soft, golden halos upon the walls. Napoleon sat at his desk, pen poised above parchment, though he had not yet written a word. His eyes lingered on the page, but his mind drifted elsewhere, following the tender rhythm of sleep that slowly crept through the house. He had dreamed again the night before, not of battle or exile, but of stillness, so vivid it woke him before dawn. In that dream, he had been a gardener. It was not a royal garden, nor grand in any way. No sculpted hedges or statues of marble adorned the paths. Instead, it was humble, overgrown in places, blooming in others. The soil beneath his fingers was dark and rich, and his hands were calloused from years of digging and planting. He wore a straw hat that had seen many summers, and a faded linen shirt. Each morning, he would step into the sun-drenched patch of earth, kneel among the rows, and begin his slow, meditative work. Weeds did not frustrate him. Insects did not anger him. Each was a part of the cycle. Each offered a reason to return. The next day, he grew lavender for the scent, rosemary for the memory, and sunflowers for the way they turned always toward the light. He tended tomato vines that twisted along old trellises and coaxed carrots from the ground with a satisfied, There was no hurry in this life, no one to impress. The plants grew at their own pace, and so did he. He imagined harvesting a small basket in the morning lemons, herbs, a few plums, and carrying it to a shaded bench near the fig tree. There, He would sit and peel the fruit, letting juice run over his fingers, watching the bees drift lazily. Between blooms, he found himself smiling. In the quiet of the longwood night, he wrote in the journal, "In this garden, I am not emperor nor exile. I am soil-touched and sun-kissed. I am witness to small miracles. A seed's surrender, the dignity of decay, the joy of green." He paused and laid the pen down. The idea of tending to life, of coaxing it gently forward rather than commanding. It soothed something deep within him. In this imagined world, he had no need to strategize or convince. He merely showed up each day with patience and intention, and the garden responded in kind. He thought of how seasons passed differently in a garden. There was no dramatic shift, only subtle transformation. Leaves yellowed slowly, flowers drooped with quiet grace, and even in winter, something beneath the soil stirred, waiting. He rose from the desk and opened the shutters. The moonlight spilled across the floor like silk. Somewhere in the distance, waves whispered against the cliffs. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. In his dream, the garden was bordered by a stone wall. Not high, not to keep anyone out, but to mark a sacred place. On the other side of that wall lived neighbors he rarely saw, but often heard singing softly in the evenings, calling to children, the bark of a dog. He liked knowing they were there, close enough to remind him he was not alone, far enough to preserve his peace. Some afternoons, he would bring them baskets of vegetables wrapped in linen. They would thank him with gentle smiles and return the favor with jars of honey or loaves of warm bread. There were no grand gestures, only kindness, exchanged like seeds. He wrote again, "I have learned from the garden that nothing rushes, that beauty arrives not in trumpet blasts, but in the opening of petals. That healing, like compost, comes from what we once discarded." He imagined himself older in this life, his back more bent, his fingers more gnarled, but still rising with the sun, still humming as he watered the roots. He would keep a dog, perhaps a gentle one with droopy eyes and a slow gait. They would walk the perimeter of the garden together each morning, checking for new growth. The dog would understand without words that the garden was not just a place, but a practice. That here, every day was a beginning. Every morning, a chance to return. He returned to his desk, added a final note, to tend something and ask nothing. In return, this is a kind of freedom. This is what no crown can give. He sealed the journal and rested his hand upon it, not with finality, but with reverence. The hour was late, yet he felt no urgency to sleep. Instead, he sat in the quiet, feeling the stillness settle around him like dew. In the soft breath of night, he pictured the garden again, not as escape, but as home. And in the gentle hush of his heart, seeds continued to grow, unseen, unrushed, unfailing. The morning light slipped quietly into Napoleon's study, filtering through the gauzy curtains in pale ribbons. The room stirred gently with its presence, as though the walls themselves exhaled at the arrival of day. Outside, dew clung to the tall grasses that framed the edges of Longwood's sparse garden, and somewhere in the distance, a solitary bird called into the silence. He had slept lightly, as was often the case, drifting in and out of dreams like a leaf floating along a slow-moving stream. Yet this morning's waking carried with it the warm residue of a vision so vivid, it felt less like a dream and more like a memory of something half-lived. In this imagined life, Napoleon was no longer bound by strategy or command. He was a wandering storyteller, not one of fame or acclaim, but a quiet figure with a worn satchel of notebooks and a voice that flowed like water. He walked from village to village, never in haste, never in want. His arrival was often unannounced, marked only by the crunch of boots on dirt paths and the soft clink of a tin mug fastened to his belt. He carried with him no manifesto, no proclamation, only stories. Tales gathered from long-forgotten corners, fragments overheard in taverns, legends whispered by firelight, stories of joy, of sorrow, of small miracles and quiet grief. He would trade them for a meal, a place by the hearth, or simply the company of a listening ear. Children would gather first, wide-eyed and eager, their laughter echoing like wind chimes. Elders came next, not with laughter, but with eyes that softened, as though they remembered something they'd long tried to forget. Farmers paused their work, wiping hands on aprons, leaning in doorways. And slowly the village would hush, drawn, inward to hear him speak. He never read from paper. His voice was low, deliberate. He painted with syllables, laid brushstrokes of sound across the canvas of evening. He spoke of rivers that remembered every stone ever cast into them, of animals who dreamed of being human, of kings who traded crowns for silence, of a moon that waited centuries for someone to say her name aloud. He watched the stories take root in the listeners, saw heads nod slowly, eyes mist over, smiles form without effort. And when he finished, there was no applause, only silence deep, full, reverent. He would bow his head slightly, thank them for listening, and accept whatever warmth they offered in return. A bowl of soup, a soft blanket, a quiet room where the wind tapped gently on the shutters. In his journal, the Napoleon of Longwood wrote, "If I had been born into stillness, I would have carried words like lanterns, shared them not as gospel, but as gifts, not to persuade, but to connect, not to conquer, but to comfort." He imagined himself seated by a fire that crackled in low conversation, a child nestled beside him, head against his shoulder, both of them wrapped in the same story. A tale that held no lesson, no command, only the soft reminder that to feel deeply was its own kind of wisdom. He turned to the window, watching the clouds stretch lazily across the sky. Perhaps, he thought, in this life of wandering tales, he would visit a coastal village next. He would sit on a low stone wall, watching boats bob in the harbor, and tell the story of a sailor who fell in love with the tide and wrote her letters on pieces of driftwood. Or perhaps he would travel inland, through golden fields, and find a quiet town where old clocks ticked slowly in shop windows. There he would tell of a man who could hear the memories stored in timepieces, each tick a whisper from the past. He smiled again at the thought. There was freedom in not knowing the next stop, in trusting that each path would lead him to another ear ready to listen. He added a final line to the morning's reflection, to be remembered not as a ruler, but as a voice carried on the wind. That is the legacy I choose tonight. Then, folding the page gently, he set down the pen and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to listen to the breeze, to the memory of voices, to the stories still waiting. Within him, outside, the grasses swayed like silent applause. And within, the storyteller continued his journey, one breath, one word, one listener at a time. The sun had barely risen above the distant hills, when Napoleon stepped out into the morning light, his breath visible in the crisp air. Dew still clung to the blades of grass, sparkling like tiny stars scattered across the earth. A quiet was complete, broken only by the gentle call of a mourning dove perched on the low stone wall that bordered the edge of the Longwood grounds. Today, his thoughts were not of battles past, nor regrets buried deep. They were not of distant thrones or shattered alliances. Instead, they were filled with the lingering essence of a dream, a life, so distant from the one he had lived that it felt like another man's story. And yet, it was his. In this dream, he had been a humble clockmaker, not in Paris, not even in Ajaccio, but in a small town nestled between misty hills and quiet rivers. The kind of place where time did not race, but flowed gently like a lullaby. In this life, he woke before the town stirred, when the sky was still pale and the world whispered its secrets only to the early risers. His shop sat at the corner of a cobbled lane, the windows fogged with the breath of morning, and behind the door, time waited patiently. It hung on every wall, ticked softly in corners, and sat quietly beneath glass domes. Pocket watches, grandfather, clocks, mantelpieces, they each held their own rhythm, their own soul. He repaired them all. With fingers steady and eyes that saw beyond the gears, he coaxed life back into things most thought lost. Springs were realigned, pendulums balanced, the tiniest screws tightened with infinite care. He knew their voices, each one different. Some ticked with pride, others with melancholy. Some were shy, some bold, but all of them told the truth in a language he understood. People brought their clocks to him with reverence, as if offering pieces of their lives to be restored. A young woman who had inherited her grandmother's locket watch, silent since the funeral. An old man whose carriage clock no longer chimed. The hour, and with it, his sense of routine. A mother whose kitchen timer had kept the rhythm of a home for decades. He never rushed. He never guaranteed speed. Only care. The townspeople, in return, respected his pace. They brought loaves of bread, jars of preserves, books, and blankets as thanks. Some stayed to talk, sitting by the stove with tea while he worked, watching the delicate ballet of wheels and levers. They asked about time, not the concept, but their time. Would the clock be ready before the baby was born? Before the harvest? Before the first snow? He always smiled and said, "It will be ready when it remembers how to breathe." In this life, he wrote little notes and tucked them inside the clock casings. Not to be read, but to be felt. Small blessings in ink. May your days be gentle. May your hours bring warmth. May your minutes hold music. And sometimes, when no one watched, he would wind each piece slowly, as if whispering a lullaby, coaxing it back to its purpose. Back in Longwood, Napoleon sat at his desk and recorded the memory with a soft hand. I did not master time. I listened to it. I tended to it as one tends a garden or a song. In this quiet life, I gave people not just hours, but the comfort of knowing they had not been forgotten by the ticking world. He closed the journal and looked out toward the sea, where the light had turned silver on the waves. He imagined his little shop once more, the way the bell over the door chimed like laughter, how the smell of oiled brass and warm wood greeted each visitor. The little stool by the workbench, worn smooth by years of sitting. He imagined his apprentice, a boy with bright eyes and quiet hands watching, learning, not just the mechanics, but the patience, the reverence. the love for things that endured. Sometimes the boy would ask, "Why fix something so old? Wouldn't it be easier to buy new?" And he would answer, "Because in its quiet rhythm, this clock has remembered more than we ever will. It has ticked through weddings, births, quiet dinners, and sleepless nights. It holds the shape of someone's life. That's not something you replace. That's something you honor." He sighed softly. To be remembered as a man who honored time, not manipulated it, not conquered it, but simply cared for it, felt like a form of peace he had never known. He rose and walked to the window. The garden below stirred with the first touch of warmth, and in his heart a clock ticked gently, faithfully, keeping time, telling truth, and whispering that even emperors dream of simpler hours. And so he let the moment stretch on unhurried, unclaimed, until the day was ready to begin. The morning fog clung gently to the hills of St. Helena, draping the landscape in a soft veil that blurred the line between memory and dream. From the narrow window of Longwood, Napoleon watched the mist dance above the dewy earth, the silence punctuated only by the distant cooing of doves and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze so light it felt imagined. He was not thinking of conquest, nor of treaties lost in dim halls of Europe. His thoughts lingered elsewhere, in a quiet, imagined life that whispered to him again the night before. A life lived not in palaces or among generals, but in a little bookshop tucked into the corner of a forgotten Parisian street. It was not the grand kind with velvet chairs and polished chandeliers. No, his bookshop was narrow and slightly crooked, with mismatched shelves and wooden floors that creaked with each gentle footfall. Its windows, fogged in the winter, bloomed with condensation in the spring, and glowed golden by candlelight in convent. The autumn dusk. In this dream, he lived alone but never felt lonely. Each morning, before the city stirred, he lit the lamps and unlatched the doors. The smell of aged paper and old ink greeted him like an old friend, mingling with the faint scent of roasting chestnuts from the street vendor across the way. He would make tea slowly, watching the steam curl like calligraphy in the air, then sit behind the worn counter, letting the silence wrap around him like a shawl. The shop bore no name above its door. It didn't need one. Its identity was in the stories it held, the memories it cradled. People who found it had not stumbled upon it. They had been quietly led, drawn by something unseen. Some ache for gentleness, some thirst for stillness. He remembered a little girl who came each Thursday, her school bag slung over her shoulder, always searching for fairy tales. She would sit cross-legged on the floor by the children's section, her fingers tracing the covers as if reading Braille. She never rushed. She took books the way others took prayer. There was an old painter who visited every Tuesday. He never bought anything, but he always left behind a sketch tucked inside a poetry collection or pasted behind the cover of a memoir. Napoleon would find them weeks later, delicate line drawings of faces, hands, birds, or even the very shop itself, viewed from a distance no one else ever noticed. One winter, a woman arrived in silence, cheeks flushed from the cold, her coat far too thin. She wandered the shop for hours without speaking, then finally approached with a copy of Les Miserables. He wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine, and as she took it, she whispered, "This book remembers me." He wrote about her in his journal that night. There are moments when a single gesture unfolding paper, tying a knot becomes sacred. Today, I gave someone not a book, but a mirror. The bookshop was a sanctuary, not only for others, but for him. It was the only place where time dissolved gently, where hours folded like pages, where solitude became symphony. He would mend broken spines with care, resew loose bindings with needle and thread, press flowers between chapters to surprise a future reader. Sometimes he tucked notes between pages, quotations, riddles, poems scribbled in the margins. He did not sign them. He wanted the books to feel as if they breathed on their own. Each evening, when the candles flickered low, he would sit in the rocking chair by the window, listening to the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the muffled steps of passers-by outside. He often read aloud, not for anyone to hear, but so that the walls themselves might absorb the words and dream them later. Back at Longwood, Napoleon closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. A man who sold no crowns, who waged no war, but who offered stories. A keeper of quiet, a merchant of dreams. In his journal, he wrote, "To live surrounded by books is to be in constant dialogue with wisdom, with folly, with beauty, with longing. It is to host the ghosts of poets and the breath of civilizations. To give a child their first myth, a widow her memory, a traveler his compass. This, too, is a kind of empire." He looked down at his own hands, calloused not from writing, but from imagined years of lifting volumes, dusting shelves, mending paper. He wondered what it would be like to know every title by heart, to recommend a book not because it was popular, but because it might make someone feel less alone. He imagined his last day in the shop, the shelves gently emptying as regulars came for one last visit, the bell above the door ringing like a lullaby. And then, as dusk fell, he would lock the door one final time, slip the key into the coat pocket, and walk away not with sorrow, but with fullness, because he had offered the world something gentle. He had tended a garden of words, and every seed had bloomed in someone's heart. He looked once more out the window, the fog now lifting too, reveal the familiar contours of St. Helena. And in that soft morning, the emperor was not missed. But the bookseller, yes, he was remembered. In whispers, in margins, in stories still being told, in the waning days of an island-bound exile, as the Atlantic winds sighed through the shutters, and the scent of salt lingered in the air, Napoleon dreamed again. This time, the dream carried him far from stone walls and the whispers of guards. It delivered him to the edge of a forest, where mountains rose like ancient guardians, and the sky was always brushed with the golden hush of dusk. Here, in this imagined life, he was not a conqueror, but a gardener. He lived in a modest cottage nestled at the foot of the hills, its roof moss-covered and its walls warmed by ivy. The path to the front door curved gently through a garden that seemed both wild and deliberate, bursting with lavender, thyme, and rows of forget-me-nots that swayed like tiny blue prayers. He woke early not to issue orders or sign decrees, but to meet the sun with quiet reverence. His boots, warm and soft, sank into the dew-kissed earth as he stepped outside each morning. He would breathe deeply, letting the cool air fill him, and whisper to the plants, calling them by name, greeting them like old friends. There were no battles here, only the slow, meditative rhythm of life. He tilled the soil by hand, his fingers pressing into its richness, feeling the pulse of the earth below. Each seed was placed with intention, each shoot tended with care. He learned the temperament of each plant, the impatience of mint, the patience of rosemary, the fickle moods of tomatoes. And he respected them all. A small greenhouse stood to one side of the property, fogged with condensation and glowing softly in the early light. Inside, he nurtured delicate things. Orchids that blushed at touch, bonsai trees shaped over years, and lily that only bloomed at night. He spoke to them as he worked, murmuring stories not of war, but of weather and stars, of the way the moonlight fell on leaves after rain. He kept a journal not of treaties, but of growth. April 2nd, he wrote once, "The chamomile has spread further than I'd expected. It smells like sleep and memory. The bees have returned to the rosemary. I watched one today for nearly an hour. I envy its simplicity." He built a bench beneath a plum tree, and each evening he would sit and watch the sky change its colors. He often read poetry there, reciting aloud not for an audience, but for the trees, the birds, and the breeze that carried his voice away. Sometimes he fell asleep with the book still open in his lap, his hat tilted over his eyes. Children from the village would wander up the path, drawn by the scent of jasmine and the hum of peace that lingered around the place. He welcomed them with open palms, offering them strawberries still warm from the sun, or carrots fresh from the soil. They called him Monsieur Jardinier, and never asked who he had been. It did not matter. One little boy, curious and wide-eyed, once asked, "Do you ever get bored, planting the same seeds again and again?" Napoleon smiled and answered, "Not once, because every bloom is a letter from the past, and every harvest a promise from the earth." He taught them gently how to listen to the soil, how to trim without wounding, how to know the time to prune and the time to wait. And in their laughter and muddy hands, he saw not an empire, but a future. Back in Longwood, the wind rustled through the shutters, and Napoleon opened his eyes slowly, still tasting the dream like a ripe fruit on his tongue. He rose from his bed, walked to the mirror, and looked not for a general or a king, but for a man who could coax life from barren land. In his journal, he wrote, "If I had tended to nations the way I tended to gardens, perhaps I might have ruled longer, or perhaps not, but I would have ruled with less regret." He imagined, for a moment, that his old enemies might see him now, not in defeat, but in peace. Hands calloused not by sword, but by spade. Eyes not sharp with strategy, but softened by sunsets. As he returned to his writing desk, he plucked a sprig of rosemary from the vase beside him and held it to his nose. It smelled of memory, of longing, of something not lost, but never quite lived, and in that moment the emperor disappeared. Only the gardener remained, content, still, remembered by the earth. In the cool hush of late afternoon, when shadows began to stretch long and golden across the garden paths of Longwood House, Napoleon sat quietly by the window, his thoughts drifting beyond the walls that contained his body but could not bind his mind. He traced the edge of a faded map with one finger, not a map of Europe, but of a place drawn only in the folds of his imagination. It was a place he returned to often in sleep, a country shaped not by borders and flags, but by rhythm, cadence, and the quiet power of words. In this dream, he was not emperor, not soldier, not strategist. He was a poet. His home was a quiet stone cottage at the edge of a glade where birches leaned gently toward the light, and the air always carried the faint, warm scent of ink and pressed flowers. There was no throne, only a writing desk near a window, a kettle that sang when ready, and shelves filled not with laws or ledgers, but with books so well loved their spines curled like smiles. Each morning he would wake just before the birds began their song, the world still cloaked in a gentle silence that made even the ticking of the clock feel sacred. He would light a single candle and sit at the desk, pulling open a leather-bound notebook that always seemed to open to a fresh page. He did not write for glory. He did not write for readers. He wrote to remember. The scratch of the quill became a meditation. Each line unfolded slowly, like mist rising off a lake. He wrote about still things, a moth circling a flame, a rain, puddle reflecting the moon, the way a child's laughter echoed inside a chapel. His poems were small but precise, like footprints left by a fox in snow. In this life, he walked often, long walks alone, through meadows and forests, over brooks, that babbled secrets in a language he felt he almost understood. He carried a small notebook in his coat, scribbling fragments of thoughts as they came. Moss grows like memory, soft and persistent. The sky after rain is the color of forgiveness. Even stones dream. Sometimes he read aloud at the local inn, where farmers and blacksmiths gathered in the evenings over cider and stew. They listened not out of duty, but out of some quiet need they did not name. And when he finished, there would be no applause, only a silence so full, so deep, it felt like an embrace. He was happiest in that silence. There was a small garden behind the cottage where he grew herbs and wildflowers. He often compared his poems to those plants. Not all would bloom, some would wither, but each had its place, its season, its quiet offering. He dried lavender and chamomile and tucked them between the pages of finished volumes. Readers later would find them like blessings. One rainy evening, a traveler knocked at his door. She was soaked, lost, and weary. He invited her in, offered tea and a warm fire. She noticed the papers strewn about, the poems pinned to the walls. She asked if he had ever published them. He smiled. "I publish to the wind," he said, and he meant it. Sometimes, late at night, he would read old poems to himself, and it was as if he were reading the letters of a dear friend. They surprised him. They comforted him. They reminded him of who he had once longed to be. Back in Longwood, Napoleon stirred from the reverie with a soft sigh. He looked at the real papers on his desk, official reports, letters unanswered, orders long expired. They felt heavy, brittle, like autumn leaves pressed too long between glass. He rose slowly and opened the window, letting the evening air in. Somewhere far off, a bird sang its final note of the day. He picked up a pen not to dictate, but to draft a verse that had whispered itself into his mind while he dreamed. I once ruled men, now I court the moon. I once waged war, now I weigh words. And in this stillness, I am more than king. He did not sign the page. He folded it, placed it beneath a book on the corner of the desk, and watched the candlelight flicker across the words. He was not writing history. He was writing peace. And though the world might never read it, in that moment, the poem was enough. In that moment, he was whole. As dusk settled over the hills, and the soft blue of twilight spilled gently across the island's quiet terrain, Napoleon lay in bed, hands folded over his chest, eyes half closed but wakeful. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass and scent. Gentle waves lapping against the distant shore. The room was still, save for the flicker of a single candle whose flame danced like a silent metronome, counting down the minutes to sleep. But tonight, he would not descend into rest with thoughts of exile or past commands. Tonight, he returned to another dream, as vivid and comforting as warm linen on a winter's evening. He dreamed of a sanctuary, built not of stone or wood, but of music. In this world, he lived in a modest house built within the folds of a valley, where the wind always carried a melody. Each window opened onto a different symphony, the rustling of oak leaves in one direction, the low hum of bees in another, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the faraway echo of a cello's solitary note. Here, Napoleon was no longer a man of war. He was a composer. His days began with silence, a sacred hush that enveloped the valley in the earliest hour. He would rise and sit at his piano, not an ornate one, but a humble instrument with warmth, keys and a dark mahogany body polished smooth by decades of touch. He would sit without hurry, fingers resting gently on the keys, and wait for the music to come, not forcing it, but listening for it, as one listens for the turning of a season. He composed not for courts or commissions, but for moments. One piece was written to accompany the opening of a flower, another to mark the passing of a cloud across the sun, a soft sonata for rain tapping against glass, a bold fugue for the roar of wind through trees. His compositions were reflections, not declarations, echoes of the world's most subtle rhythms. Villagers would sometimes gather outside his window in the evening, listening as the notes spilled softly into the dark. Children leaned against their mothers. Lovers held hands without speaking, and old men smiled without reason. The music didn't ask anything of them. It offered only presence. He kept journals filled with unfinished scores and little notations scribbled in the margins. F-sharp like the color of twilight. A rest here to mimic breath. Let the silence between the notes carry the meaning. There were no audiences, clamoring for performances, no applause, only quiet understanding. A small gramophone in the corner played the pieces he had completed, and he often listened to them late at night while sipping warm milk and staring into the fire. He closed his eyes and let the melodies wrap around him like a shawl. Sometimes he wept, not from sorrow, but from the sheer relief of having something inside him spoken so completely without words. He taught local children to play, not by strict notation, but by feeling. Play the sunrise, he would say. Play the moment you last saw your mother smile. Play the way you feel when you stand beneath a sky full of stars. One boy, timid and unsure, once asked, "But what if I play the wrong notes?" Napoleon smiled and replied, "There are no wrong notes, only unspoken truths." He built a small concert hall from cedar and stone, open to the air, where owls sometimes perched in the rafters and vines rolled around the railings. It hosted no grand galas, just quiet gatherings where music and moonlight mingled, and people came not to be impressed, but to be still. Back in Longwood House, the candle on his knitstand flickered low. Napoleon stirred, breathing deeper now, his mind nestled in the warmth of that melody-born world. He turned slightly, as if to reach for a piano that was not there. He murmured a line to himself before sleep pulled him fully under. Let the world be noisy. I will live in the pause. And so he did, night after night, measure by measure, composing peace, living not in conquest, but in cadence. In the hush of early dawn, when the sky was a pale wash of silver and the world had yet to stir, Napoleon stood at the edge of a great empty stage. It was not a battlefield, nor a palace court. It was a theater quiet, reverent, waiting. The red velvet curtain hung still. The rows of empty seats lay shrouded in shadow, and the golden balconies curled like ivy above his head. Yet there was no audience here, only memory. He stepped softly across the worn wooden boards, boots muffled by decades of dust, his hands clasped behind his back. There was something sacred in this space, not for its grandeur, but for its silence. He had not come to perform, not to proclaim, but to remember a version of himself that never walked onto the stage, but stood always in its wings watching, longing. He had once imagined a life in the theater, in the world of stories, not strategy. In this dream, he was not the architect of empires, but the quiet soul behind a curtain, orchestrating illusions that felt truer than life. He was a playwright. His quill moved not in the service of orders or legislation, but of dialogue sharp, vulnerable, aching. He wrote characters who spoke truths he himself could not, who lived failures he dared not confess, who found redemption in moments too small for history books. In the quiet hours of the morning, he would sit by a lamp and write in longhand, his words curling across the page like tendrils of smoke. A man can command armies and still not understand his own heart. It is easier to conquer a city than to forgive your brother. When the applause fades, what remains of the soul? His plays were never staged in grand halls. Instead, they were performed in humble parlors and candlelit barns, with actors drawn from among friends and villagers, each performance more heartfelt than polished. The stage was not measured by its size, but by the sincerity of its silence when a scene landed true. He recalled one performance in particular, a tale of an aging general who longed not for glory, but for the embrace of a child he never knew. The room had gone utterly still, breath held in unison, until the final line was spoken. All my medals weigh less than the touch of your hand. And the audience wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition. He never published these plays. He tucked them away in a trunk beneath his bed, their pages marked with candle wax, the corners soft from revisiting. They were not meant for critics or accolades. They were conversations with himself, a mirror held up to the soul he kept hidden beneath the epaulets and titles. In this life, he lived above a small theater, nestled between bookshops on a cobbled street. The windows always smelled of old parchment and lavender oil. In the evenings, he would descend the narrow staircase to check on the set pieces, adjust a costume, or comfort a nervous actor. He was known not as a conqueror, but as Monsieur N, the gentle patron of dreams. Children would gather by the door to listen through the cracks, and afterward, he would sit with them on the steps and answer their questions, not as a teacher, but as a fellow dreamer. He told them that stories were not escapes, but lanterns for the dark, that heroes were not always brave, and villains not always cruel. He once said, "Every emperor is just a man in costume. Every tyrant is someone's frightened son." Back in Longwood, the dream began to dissolve, the creak of the real floorboards beneath his bed reminding him of the weight of the present. But the script still lingered in his mind. He reached for his journal and jotted down a single stage direction. Enter a man, finally unmasked. And with that, he smiled just a little as he drifted toward sleep, not as a ruler, but as a storyteller, not remembered in statues, but in scenes whispered into the hearts of those who dared to imagine him otherwise. In the stillness of a rainy afternoon, with soft droplets tracing paths down the window panes, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth, Napoleon found himself sitting beneath the rustling canopy of an old chestnut tree, its leaves trembling with every gentle gust of wind. The dream that embraced him now was one of return, not to a battlefield or capital, but to a childhood left far behind, buried beneath the weight of empires. He was a boy again, no taller than the lowest branch, his shoes caked in mud, a book tucked under his arm. The Corsican hills stretched before him, lush and wild, humming with cicadas and the occasional distant bleat of a goat. There were no guards, no maps, no letters to dictate, only the wind and his thoughts mingling like old friends. In this life, Napoleon had never left Corsica. He had never crossed the sea to serve in distant courts, never worn the uniform of command. Instead, he had remained close to the soil, the sea, the language of his mother, the laughter of his brothers. He had become a teacher. Every morning, he opened the small schoolhouse at the edge of the village, a one-room stone cottage, with blue shutters and ivy crawling up its sides. The children would arrive in twos and threes, sometimes barefoot, always curious. They brought with them the smell of olive groves, the sharpness of wood smoke, and the noise of a world still unshaped. He taught them history, yes, but not the kind of history etched in monuments. He taught them the histories of trees, of rivers, of families. He would read aloud stories of ancient heroes, pausing not to emphasize the conquests, but the doubts. What do you think Achilles feared most? He'd ask. Or, do you believe Caesar was ever lonely? The children learned not to memorize, but to feel. And when they asked questions, he listened, not with the impatience of a busy man, but with the full attention of someone who believed every answer mattered. He kept a garden just outside the schoolhouse, and together with the children, they tended to tomatoes, rosemary, and figs. He taught them to write poems about the harvest, to describe the wind without using the word wind, to sit in silence and notice the way light changed as the day aged. One child, Elio, once asked, "Master, why did you never leave this island? Don't you want to see the world?" Napoleon had smiled, pressing a fig into the boy's palm. The world comes to those who learn how to see it. On Sundays, he held lessons beneath the chestnut tree, where he read passages from Dante and Homer, and then invited the children to share their own stories. They told tales of mythical sea serpents, of lost caves filled with treasure, of grandparents who could speak to birds. Every story was welcomed, cherished, folded into the fabric of their little community. He painted too in watercolors, landscapes mostly, the same hill in every season, a father mending nets, a dog sleeping beside a loaf of bread. He signed his paintings with just a small cursive N, not out of secrecy, but humility. In the evenings, the villagers gathered around the fire just outside the schoolhouse. There was wine, olives, music played on old instruments. Napoleon would sometimes read aloud from a favorite novel or share a memory from his boyhood. He was not the center, but a thread in the weave, a man among many, content in his smallness. He once wrote in a letter, never sent, Had I conquered less, I might have loved more. Back in Longwood, the wind tapped gently at the shutters. Napoleon stirred, the corners of his mouth turning slightly upward. His hand moved softly along the edge of the sheet, as if brushing the leaves of a tree he had once sat beneath. He whispered into the dim room, to no one in particular, "I never left." And in that moment, perhaps he hadn't. He remained in Corsica, in the hush of a classroom, in the laughter of children, in a fig shared by firelight. The mist clung low across the meadows, softening the sharp lines of the horizon, as if the world itself were exhaling a sigh of memory. In the quiet heart of this landscape stood a cottage unlike any other in Napoleon's dreams, a sanctuary where time bent, where days unfolded not in decrees or dispatches, but in delicate pages of a manuscript left unfinished. He walked through the wooden door, worn smooth by the years, and entered a room filled with the scent of ink, candle wax, and dried lavender. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of journals, folios, and half-filled ledgers. The hearth was cold, yet the room was warmed by thought, by memory, by the presence of something gently persistent. In this life, Napoleon had chosen a different path. He had not pursued empire or command, but had become a historian. Not the kind who wrote of battles in blood and steel, but of the quiet currents of ordinary lives. He chronicled forgotten traditions, recorded the spoken tales of fishermen and shepherds, and preserved in ink the laughter of markets, the silence of morning vales, the songs hummed to children in the dark. He kept no titles, wore no medals. His most prized possession was a simple, ink-stained journal, bound in leather, into which he wrote each day. He wrote not to be read widely, but to remember deeply, to notice. One entry read, "Today, the baker wept as he shaped the loaves. His wife passed last winter, and still, each morning, he kneads the dough with one hand and steadies a photograph with the other." Another, "A girl in the village sang to the goats, and they followed her as if enchanted. Her voice was a ribbon through the valley." And still another, "There are no small lives, only unnoticed ones." His home became a gathering place for those with stories too fragile for history books. Veterans who no longer dreamed of drums, but of rain on tin roofs. Widows who remembered the scent of a lost scarf. Children who had seen a fox disappear into a field and wondered if it were magic. They came with their memories, and he listened, truly listened. Not for details to record, but for the music of their voices, the breath between words, the tremble of a smile. Each evening, he lit a single candle, sat by the window, and wrote. His hand moved slowly, reverently. He recorded not just what was said, but what was felt, the weight of a pause, the tremble of a choice. Once a year, he would walk to the village square and hang a single page from a tree branch. On it would be a story unsigned, unclaimed. By morning, the page would be gone, taken by someone who needed it. He never asked where it went. The wind carried stories where they were meant to be. In his dream, he saw himself older, his hair silvered, his posture softened. But his eyes remained bright, curious. He had become a guardian of the invisible. A woman once asked him, "Why do you care so much for stories that are not your own?" He answered, "Because they are. We are made of each other, one memory at a time." One night, a storm came, fierce, wild, and brief. In the morning, A branch had fallen across the path outside his home. Beneath it, unharmed, was a page he had not yet written, blank, save for one word at the top, begin. And so he did. In Longwood, as the wind rustled through the window panes and the night pressed gently in, Napoleon stirred in his sleep, his fingers curling as if around a quill. Not to command, but to remember. Not to conquer, but to witness. In a world where every breath held a story, he had become a listener, and that, more than any empire, was his quiet legacy. He dreamed on, with ink in his veins and silence as his crown. The wind that swept through the valleys of his memory was cool and carried the scent of citrus and sea salt. In this dreamscape, Napoleon found himself walking the weathered docks of a quiet coastal town, not as an emperor returning in triumph, but as a traveler without urgency, with sand in his boots and salt on his skin. The town was nameless yet familiar. Its rhythm was the lull of tide against stone, the creak of wooden masts, and the laughter of sailors who had stories etched into their faces. In this life, he had become a shipwright. Each morning, as the first gold of dawn peeled over the horizon, Napoleon walked barefoot down the shore to a small boatyard he called the Nest. Here, he worked alongside craftsmen whose hands were calloused from years of bending wood to will. Together, they built not great vessels of war, but modest boats meant to carry fishermen into the embrace of the sea and return them home safely. His palms bore the imprint of tools, and his clothes were never clean. He smelled of sawdust, pine, resin, and sun. He found joy in the texture of raw timber, the way it whispered of forests long past, of rain once absorbed, of wind once resisted. He spoke to the wood, not aloud, but in the language of patience, measuring twice, sanding slowly, waiting. There was a boy who came often to watch him work, a quiet child with eyes too large for his face and questions too heavy for his years. One day, the boy asked, "Why do you make boats when you never sail them?" Napoleon smiled, running his hand along the smooth hull of the small vessel. "Because even dreams need vessels." The boy did not understand then, but returned every day, watching the process with reverence, as though watching prayers take shape in cedar. Napoleon named each boat after a moment of silence. Twilight pause, unspoken goodbye, first breath. After grief, no names of gods or saints. Just moments people carried, but rarely spoke of. He kept a small journal tucked into his coat, a habit he had not shed. In it, he wrote observations as he carved. The sea teaches humility better than defeat. Wood forgives the hand that honors its grain. Even water remembers. He made time to sit with the old men of the village, those who had once sailed far beyond the horizon and now found peace in feeding gulls or mending nets. They told him tales of stars that guided lost ships home, of sea creatures glimpsed in, mist of friends who vanished into storms. Napoleon never corrected, never doubted. He listened as if these stories were constellations themselves, necessary to navigate the vastness of being. At dusk, he would walk to the edge of the breakwater, where the sea met the sky in an endless hush. He'd sit alone, toes in the surf, watching each boat he had built return with nets full or empty. It did not matter. What mattered was return. There was a woman in the village, Elera, who sold candied oranges and mended sails with a needle threaded through her necklace. She spoke little, but her silences were eloquent. They shared dinners sometimes. Not romance, but something quieter. Companionship built not of passion, but of shared solitude. He never spoke of his past, and she never asked. One evening, as the wind tugged gently at the linen curtains, she said only, "You build with grief, but what you make floats." In Longwood, his breathing deepened, his fingers twitching as though smoothing the edge of a hull. The rustle of trees. Outside became the sound of tide. The creak of shutters became rope on mast. He turned his head slightly, as if to hear a voice not in the room. "That one," he whispered in sleep. "Name it after the storm." And somewhere, in a dream shaped of salt and wood, a boy set sail, not to conquer, but to wonder. The air in this dream was thin, light as parchment. It smelled of ink and beeswax, and something older still, the distant memory of libraries long vanished. Napoleon wandered through quiet corridors, dimly lit by oil lamps, their flames swaying like sighs. Each step he took echoed, not with the sound of boots, but of pages turning. Here, he had become a keeper of forgotten books. He lived within a circular stone tower, nestled in the hollow of a hidden forest. It had no address, no bell, and no visitors. Just books' endless shelves curving into spirals, each volume dusted by hand, each one a memory waiting to be opened. Some spines were cracked and golden, others bound in velvet and twine. All of them whispered stories no one remembered to ask about anymore. Every morning, he brewed tea from wild herbs and sat cross-legged in the center of the reading chamber, selecting one book at random. Sometimes it was a diary from a nameless sailor. Other times it was a poem scrawled in pencil by a girl who had never seen the sea. The words inside were tender, raw, unpolished, but true. He never corrected spelling. He never judged the clumsy grammar. He simply read, and in the reading, the writer lived again. In his ledger, he noted the books not by title, but by the emotion they left behind. The one with the aching sonata, the one that smelled of chrysanthemums, the one that forgave. He found in time that when he read aloud, the tower responded. If the story was sad, the wind sighed through the shutters. If it was joyful, birds gathered at the window, chirping softly as if offering applause. He read slowly, never more than one book per day. Stories deserve space to echo. In one of the tower's upper rooms was a peculiar book that changed each time he opened it. Its pages were blank at first, but as he touched them, ink would bloom one letter at a time, revealing thoughts he hadn't known he carried. It was not a book of prophecy, but of reflection. It spoke to his soul, not his fate. One passage. Read, to lead is to be watched, but to read is to disappear. Another. All the battles you regret are less heavy than the love you denied. He often wondered who wrote the words. Perhaps it was his own mind, softened by silence. Or perhaps it was the tower itself, dreaming through him. There was a cat-thin, gray, and soft pod that wandered through the rooms. It never meowed, never asked for attention. It simply curled up beside him, blinking slowly as he read aloud. Sometimes he imagined it had once belonged to a scribe or a monk, or perhaps it had been born from the ink itself. On rainy days, he opened the small attic window and listened as the drops tapped the roof in delicate rhythms. He would close his eyes and imagine each drop a letter, forming poems he could not see but deeply felt. The rain wrote for him, and he listened. In the village below the forest, Though few knew the tower existed, there was an old woman who claimed she once saw light spill from its highest window. She said she heard a voice reading something so beautiful, it made her forget her own name for a moment. She smiled when she said it. Back in Longwood, Napoleon's hand twitched against the blanket. His lips parted, mouthing silent syllables. The room around him was still, yet somewhere in his dream, a book was being opened. And on the page, "This story is not over." He would read until the candle burned low, until the ink dried, until even the cat closed its eyes. He would read not to remember, not to forget, but simply to feel the weight of each word settle like dust on the shelves of his soul. Not to conquer, but to read. The air shimmered with warmth, as if the world itself were exhaling after a long, silent breath. In this quiet dream, Napoleon stood on a grassy hill overlooking a vast golden field, wheat swaying in rhythmic waves like the sea of his childhood memories. There was no army, no thunder of hooves, only the hush of wind and the soft hum of bees drifting lazily through the summer air. In this life, he had become a gardener. Not a gardener of palaces or prized roses, but of memory. His plot of land stretched far and wide, though nothing grew in neat rows. Wild herbs mingled with sweet peas. Lavender curled among the vines of morning glory. Sunflowers turned their faces toward the sky, as if listening for something. It was not order he sought, but harmony, a chaos that breathed. Each morning, with the first blush of light, he knelt in the soil. His fingers, strong but softened by years without swords, burrowed into the earth with reverence. He spoke to the seeds not with words, but with touch, laying them gently into beds of damp soil, covering them like secrets meant to be slowly revealed. There was no rush. Time in the garden moved like mist, slipping between the fingers, never fully grasped, but always felt. He learned the language of leaves, the rhythm of roots. Some days he sang low, wordless melodies that matched the cadence of digging, watering, pruning. Other days he remained silent, letting the garden speak. And it did, through color, through fragrance, through the patient blooming of things once thought dead. There was a small bench beneath a willow tree where he sat each evening. From there, he watched dragonflies dance above the pond. He watched the moon cast its silver hush across the petals. He listened to the hush, the sacred hush that settled when the day ended, but the garden lived on. Children came sometimes, curious barefoot wanderers who ran through the fields and left laughter behind like breadcrumbs. They asked questions. Why do you talk to the flowers? Why don't you pick the prettiest ones? And he answered simply, because they are listening. Because beauty grows again when left alone. He kept a notebook tucked into a tin watering can, pages filled not with maps or strategies, but with sketches of leaves, poems about moss, reflections written in soil-smudged script. Growth is not measured by height, but by peace. The bloom does not mourn the bud. There was one plant he tended with special care, a vine of deep indigo, its flowers opening only at night. He called it Silencio. It had no scent, no thorns, and did not twist around trellises. It grew as it pleased, often in places he didn't expect. But every evening, it opened beneath the moonlight like a breath held all day, finally released. One day, as autumn whispered its first crisp breath, he discovered a visitor. An old woman stood at the edge of the garden, her dress the color of ash, her hands folded neatly before her. "This place was not here before," she said. Napoleon smiled, brushing soil from his palms. "It was always here. It just needed quiet." She nodded and walked among the flowers, pausing here and there. When she reached the bench beneath the willow, she sat, and from her pocket, she pulled a single seed. "Would you plant this for me?" she asked. He took it without question, cradling it as though it were fragile as breath. That evening, beneath the veil of twilight, he found a place near the pond, dug gently, and laid it into the earth. "Rest well," he whispered. Back in Longwood, the air in the room grew sweet with the imagined perfume of lavender and loam. Napoleon's chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, his fingers twitching as if brushing petals. In his dream, he turned to the willow and saw the seed had sprouted overnight tall, golden, glowing softly under the stars. And he smiled, not to conquer, but to grow. The stars blinked like watchful eyes in the endless navy above. In this dream, the world was hushed beneath their ancient gaze. The land was flat and wide, a sprawling plain of soft sand that shimmered silver beneath the moonlight. Napoleon stood at its center, no longer a man of battles or borders, but a traveler between silences. This was not a battlefield. It was a desert of memory. Each grain of sand held a thought he once forgot, a decision he once made, or a moment that passed without his notice. He walked barefoot, the cool sand pressing against the soles of his feet like echoes. With every step, he felt lighter, as though each memory released from the sand loosened something inside him. He carried no compass, no map, only a lantern that glowed with a soft blue light, not enough to see the end, but enough to guide his next step. At intervals, he came upon stone markers rising like teeth from the dunes. On each was inscribed a single word: beloved, failed, waited, enough. He paused at each, placing his hand on the stone, letting the memory bloom quietly. Some made him smile, others sigh. None made him turn back. There was no path, but he moved with purpose. His body remembered this place, even if his waking mind could not. He followed the wind, which carried the scent of parchment and sea salt reminders, of letters written long ago, and the voyages he dreamed of taking, but never did. In the distance stood a pavilion, its curtains fluttering like breath. He reached it by morning light. Inside, there was only a table and a single quill resting in an inkpot of melted frost. No paper, just the table, the pen, and a silence so deep it echoed. He sat, and slowly, the surface of the table began to change. It became soft, like water, like memory made liquid. He dipped the quill and wrote, not with words, but with feelings. Each stroke became a ripple across the surface. He wrote of things he never spoke aloud: the ache behind triumph, the fear behind decisions, the tenderness he hid, even from himself. When he stopped, the table stilled. The ripples faded, leaving only a reflection of the sky. And in that reflection, he saw himself not as an emperor, not as a prisoner, but as a boy again, on the shores of Corsica, chasing the tide. He left the pavilion and walked further until the sand became firmer, the wind quieter. There, beneath a stone arch, he found a pool of water black as ink, still as glass. Beside it lay a worn book, its cover cracked and sun-bleached. He opened it to find only one sentence on the first page: "To forgive is not to forget, but to Remember without weight. He closed the book. He sat by the pool and waited. The stars faded. The wind stilled. And the dream held him like the tide holds a shell. Back in Longwood, a breeze stirred the curtain. Napoleon's chest rose in a rhythm so slow it almost matched the desert wind. A faint smile touched his lips as if, somewhere inside, he had found peace not in conquering or ruling, but in walking quietly through his own unspoken sands, not to command, but to remember. The sea whispered in ancient tongues. A soft chant, it pulsed in the stillness of night. In this dream, Napoleon stood at the edge of a rugged cliff, wind brushing through his hair with fingers cooler than memory. Below him, the ocean stretched to the edge of the world, its surface dappled with moonlight, as if stars had fallen gently into the waves. He wore no crown, no cloak, just a woolen coat and worn boots damp with salt spray. Behind him, an old lighthouse loomed, its beam turning slowly in the dark, like a sentinel watching over ghosts. The cliff was sacred ground, not by decree or worship, but by time. It was a place he returned to often in dreams, a liminal space between breath, silence. Tonight, the sea sang louder. He walked along the edge, careful but unafraid, until he reached a carved bench of driftwood and stone. It faced the horizon, with the sky melted into water. He sat, and his breath synchronized with the waves. Inhale with the tide's retreat. Exhale with its return. From beneath his coat, he drew a small tin box. Inside, folded notes, pressed flowers, a feather, a piece of broken glass. Each an artifact from a memory. Each placed there long ago with intention. He unfolded the first note. The paper was yellowed and soft as skin. In his own handwriting, a single line. Some wars are waged in silence. He remembered the moment. Clearly, not on a battlefield, but in a hallway, standing before a closed door. A conversation he never had. A truth he never voiced. A goodbye he never gave. The flower was a violet, wilted but whole, from the gardens of Malmaison, pressed between. Pages of a book he never finished. He held it between his fingers and smelled earth and old laughter. A memory of gentleness, untouched by ambition. The feather was gray, from a dove that once landed on his windowsill during exile. It had stared at him without fear. In that moment, he had felt seen, not as emperor, not as legend, just as a man. The glass shard was from a mirror, broken during his last days in Paris. He had looked into it too long, searching for something certainty, perhaps, or forgiveness. All he found was reflection. He placed the items back into the box, closed it gently, and rested it on his lap. The ocean wind carried a voice, not words, not sound, but presence. He looked toward the lighthouse, its beam sweeping once more across the cliffs. And then he saw her, a figure walking barefoot along the edge, her dress trailing like mist. She moved with the grace of moonlight, her face half hidden by shadows. When she reached him, she sat beside him without a word. They did not speak. They listened to the waves, to the wind, to the silence between. After some time, she reached into her coat and removed a stone-smooth, white round. She placed it in his hand. "You drop this," she said. He turned it over, etched into its surface. A spiral. He remembered it. From childhood. From Corsica. From a moment before ambition, before conquest, before titles. He had held this stone. Once, thrown it into the sea, watched it skip and vanish. A wish tied to its flight, one he had forgotten. She rose. "It was always yours," she whispered. He clutched the stone as if it pulsed with warmth, with memory, with something lost and now returned. When he looked up again, she was gone. Only her footprints remained in the frost-tipped grass. Back in Longwood, the room exhaled. Curtains shifted like sails in a gentle breeze. Napoleon's hand curled softly, as if holding something precious. In the silence, there was no empire, no exile. Number passed. Only the sea, the stone, and the stillness of a memory recovered, not to possess, but to remember what was once given away. The garden was overgrown, its paths swallowed by moss and soft vines that wrapped around broken statues and time-worn columns. The air shimmered with the faint golden hue of morning, and the world was thick with stillness. This was not the garden of emperors, nor the grounds of palaces. It was a forgotten space, nestled between memory and forgiveness, where nature had reclaimed the silence left behind by ambition. Napoleon entered slowly, his boots brushing against dew-laced grass. He wore a linen shirt and loose trousers, as though he had shed not just his title, but the weight of his many names. The birds did not scatter at his presence. Instead, they continued their gentle chorus, as if welcoming an old friend who had finally come home. He paused at the edge of a dry fountain, its basin cracked, its once proud sculpture now covered in ivy. The shape was still visible, a child holding a book open to the sky. He recognized it instantly. It had once stood in the garden of a house he visited as a boy, a place where dreams were simpler and futures undefined. He sat on the rim of the fountain, running his fingers over the ivy and stone, letting the textures ground him. The air smelled of lavender and earth. He closed his eyes, and then the garden shifted. With a breath, the vines loosened, the sunlight deepened, and the statue's eyes began to glow softly, as if lit by the sun within. A gentle hum filled the air, not mechanical, but organic like wind moving through harp strings. He opened his eyes to find the garden alive. The trees whispered in Corsican. The flowers opened their petals toward him, and the path, once hidden beneath overgrowth, unfurled before him like a scroll. He stood and followed it. The path led to a clearing where a long table had been set, though no chairs stood around it. Each place was marked not by name, but by relics. A broken toy soldier, a page torn from a book of poetry, a pair of worn gloves, a cracked compass. He understood. These were pieces of people who had once been close, each item holding the breath of a conversation, a moment, a silence. He moved from setting to setting, touching each object with reverence. Some brought warmth, others sorrow. One brought laughter, a sound so rare it startled the birds into a flutter. In the center of the table stood a small cake, uncut, topped with a single candle unlit. He reached into his coat and found, inexplicably, a match. He struck it, and the candle came to life. And then he remembered. This was his mother's garden. The cake was for his 7th birthday. The memory had been so deeply buried beneath layers of war and strategy that it had become faint. But now, in the quiet of the dream, it emerged full and whole. She had baked it herself. He sat at the table, the candlelight soft on his face. The garden hushed, as if listening, and in that moment, he allowed the weight to lift. Not all of it, but enough. Back in Longwood, Dawn slipped quietly into the room, painting the walls with soft pastels. Napoleon shifted in his sleep, his breathing calm, and if one listened closely, they might hear the faintest echo of laughter carried on the morning breeze light, delicate and long overdue, not to return, but to allow the past to bloom where it once had withered. The morning mist lingered over the gentle hills, softening the edges of the world as if time itself paused to breathe. Napoleon walked slowly along a winding path, the earth beneath his feet damp with dew, the scent of wet leaves and wildflowers filling the crisp air. This place was not the battlefield or the court of kings he once knew. It was a garden of memories, where the past and present folded into one quiet space. In this dream, he was a gardener, not of roses or grand estates, but of forgotten moments and tender recollections. Each step brought him closer to the heart of the garden, where vines curled protectively around ancient stones, and the soft hum of bees wove through the air like a gentle lullaby. He knelt beside a cluster of bluebells, their delicate petals nodding in the breeze, and ran his fingers through the soft earth. Here, in the soil, lay the stories of a lifetime, some buried deep, others just beneath the surface, waiting to bloom. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows that danced with the rhythm of the day. He breathed slowly, savoring the peace that had long eluded him. In this space, there were no battles to fight, no crowns to wear, only the steady, patient growth of life reclaiming itself. Napoleon took from his coat a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with sketches and words that mapped the contours of this inner landscape. He traced the outlines of leaves and petals, but more than that, he wrote of the feelings they stirred. The quiet resilience of a sprout breaking through stone, the gentle surrender of a flower fading into autumn. As he moved deeper into the garden, he found a stone bench beside a still pond, its surface mirroring the sky with a clarity that seemed almost sacred. He sat and watched the water ripple softly with the touch of a passing breeze. The pond held reflections not just of the world above, but of memories held deep within the laughter of children, the warmth of a mother's embrace, the ache of farewell whispered in silence. He opened his journal and began to write, each word a seed planted carefully in the fertile soil of thought. Growth is not marked by haste, he wrote, but by the gentle unfolding of time's hands. The smallest leaf, the quietest bloom, bears witness to the strength found in patience. The garden around him seemed to respond, the flowers turning toward the light as if acknowledging his truth. The air carried the scent of lavender and thyme, mingled with the earthiness of moss and bark. Somewhere, a bird sang a melody so soft it felt like a secret meant only for the heart. Napoleon smiled, feeling the weight of his past lift, replaced by a tender hope rooted in this moment of stillness. He understood now that to tend a garden was to tend oneself, to nurture the fragile places with care, to honor the cycles of loss and renewal. He imagined the seasons passing, the blooms of spring, the warmth of summer, the quiet decay of autumn, and the restful sleep of winter. Each phase held its own beauty, its own lessons. The garden was not a refuge from life, but a metaphor for it, a place where even the smallest acts of attention could cultivate peace. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows and bathing the world in gold, Napoleon closed his journal and rose. He took one last breath of the fragrant air and looked out over the landscape, knowing that this garden, this life, was his to nurture, no matter how far he had come or how many battles he had faced. And in that understanding, he found a gentle kind of freedom, not in conquest, not in glory, but in the quiet, steady art of growth. The sky stretched wide and calm over a quiet village nestled between rolling hills, where the sun's first light brushed the rooftops with a gentle glow. Napoleon wandered through narrow cobblestone streets, his footsteps soft and unhurried, as if the world itself had slowed to match his contemplative rhythm. In this dream, he was not the commander of armies, but a humble clockmaker, tending to the quiet heartbeat of time itself. His workshop was a small, cozy room tucked beneath a sloping roof, filled with the warm scent of polished wood, oil, and the faint trace of old paper. Clocks of all sizes ticked gently from shells in Wall's grandfather clocks. Pocket watches and delicate mantelpieces, all telling stories of moments past and memories preserved. Each clock held a pulse, a whisper of lives once lived, celebrations held, tears shed, and silent nights endured. Napoleon's hands moved with care and reverence, coaxing life back into their intricate gears, aligning pendulums and tightening tiny screws. He listened deeply, not just to their ticks, but to the spaces between the silences where time seemed to breathe. People came to him with broken timepieces, not for mere repair, but for the restoration of connection. A young mother brought the locket watch her grandmother had given her, silent since the day she passed. An elderly man sought to hear again the chimes of his childhood mantel clock, now mute for decades. A child clutched a battered music box, hoping to recall the lullaby that once soothed restless nights. Napoleon never rushed his work. Each repair was an act of patience and love, a conversation with history, a meditation on the fragile passage of moments. He often spoke softly to the clocks, as if they were old friends, telling them stories of the lives they had marked, and the hope of many more moments to come. Outside, the village breathed in the rhythms of day and night, its people moving to the quiet tempo of seasons and simple joys. The clockmaker's work stitched the fabric of time, weaving continuity and grace into the daily lives of those who came to him. In the evenings, he sat by a small fire, listening to the gentle ticking that filled the room like a comforting song. His mind wandered to the hands that once held these clocks, fingers that folded letters, held children's hands, signed trees, or whispered secrets. Each tick was a heartbeat, each chime a memory ringing clear across the years. He wrote little notes and tucked them inside the case's small blessings and poems, meant to be discovered by future owners. May your hours be kind, one read. May your minutes hold laughter. Sometimes, as twilight deepened, villagers gathered outside. His workshop, drawn by the soft glow of candlelight and the steady rhythm of ticking clocks. They listened as Napoleon played gentle melodies on an old wooden piano, his music mingling with the cadence of time and memory. He taught the children not just how to fix clocks, but how to listen to the rhythm of the world, to the silent spaces that give meaning to sound. Time is not measured by hands or numbers, he would say, but by moments that take our breath away. And in that simple truth, he found his peace. Napoleon closed the shutters as night fell, his heart quiet and full. The clocks around him ticked on, steady and sure, as if keeping vigil. Outside, the stars blinked awake, and somewhere far away, the sea whispered its timeless song. He rested, knowing that in tending to time, he tended to life itself, not with power, not with force, but with gentle care. The early morning light filtered softly through sheer curtains, casting a gentle glow over a quiet study filled with books and delicate instruments. Napoleon sat in a worn leather chair, his fingers tracing the rim of a brass astrolabe resting on the desk before him. This was a world of quiet discovery, a refuge far from the clamor of courts and battlefields, a place where time was measured not by war, but by the movement of stars and the slow turning of the heavens. In this dream, he was an astronomer. His days began before dawn, when the sky was still a deep velvet sprinkled with shimmering points of light. He would climb the spiral staircase to a stone observatory perched on a hill, its domed roof opening wide to embrace the cosmos. There, he traced the paths of planets, charted the courses of comets, and listened to the silent symphony of the universe unfolding above. The night sky was his canvas, and he painted with the light of distant suns. Each star told a story, each constellation held a secret. He recorded his observations in journals, filled with intricate diagrams and gentle musings, notes not just of science, but of wonder and awe. Villagers would sometimes gather near the base of the hill, eyes turned upward, eager to glimpse the mysteries beyond their small world. Napoleon welcomed them with quiet joy, pointing out the patterns, sharing tales of ancient myths woven into the fabric of the night sky. He spoke not as a teacher, but as a fellow traveler seeking answers in the vastness. His favorite star was Sirius, the brightest beacon in the night, which he called his guiding light. To him, it was more than a celestial body. It was a symbol of hope, a constant in a world of change. One evening, as a gentle breeze stirred the leaves outside, Napoleon wrote in his journal, "The stars remind us that even in darkness, there is light. That distance does not diminish presence. That though we are small, we are part of something vast and beautiful." He often reflected on the parallels between the heavens and his own life, the orbits of people and events, the cycles of rise and fall, the eternal dance of light and shadow. Back in his study, the brass instruments glimmered softly in the candlelight. He carefully adjusted a telescope, aligning it with the polar star, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Outside, the village slept beneath a blanket of thaw. Stars, their dreams carried on cosmic winds. Napoleon's heart felt light, buoyed by the quiet grandeur of the universe. He understood, in that serene moment, that he was both insignificant and infinite, a single note in an endless melody. And as he closed his journal, he whispered to the night, "May we all find our guiding stars." The dawn broke soft and golden over a tranquil countryside, where gentle hills rolled beneath skies painted with hues of peach and lavender. Napoleon walked slowly along a narrow dirt path, bordered by wildflowers nodding in the morning breeze. This was not a path to power or conquest, but a journey inward to a place where time slowed and the heart spoke in whispers. In this dream, he was a storyteller, not the grand orator commanding crowds, but a quiet weaver of tales, gathering fragments of memory and weaving them into tapestries of meaning. He carried a leather-bound book, its pages blank yet waiting, eager to be filled with the stories of those he met. He traveled from village to village, stopping beneath shade trees and around hearth fires. He listened more than he spoke, hearing the unspoken, the fears, the hopes, the silent longings that dwelled in every heart. Children gathered around him, eyes wide with wonder, as he spun gentle tales of forgotten heroes and everyday miracles. His voice was soft, a soothing rhythm that carried them to faraway lands and deep within their own souls. He told stories, not of battles or crowns, but of kindness, a baker's first loaf, a mother's lullaby, a friendship that bridged a lifetime. Each tale was a seed, planted carefully in the fertile soil of imagination. In the evenings, beneath a canopy of stars, he wrote his stories in the quiet glow of a lantern. His pen moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the contours of human experience with empathy and grace. He never sought fame or recognition. His reward was the gentle smiles of listeners, the peaceful sighs at story's end, the flicker of understanding in tired eyes. Napoleon understood that stories had power not to conquer or control, but to heal and connect. They were bridges spanning time and distance, threads weaving the fabric of shared humanity. He often recalled his own life, filled with thunder and tempest, and marveled at the quiet strength found in simple acts, a letter written, a hand held, a truth spoken softly. In the twilight of his dream, he sat beneath an ancient oak, the leaves whispering secrets overhead. He opened his book and began to write a story of peace, of forgiveness, of homecoming, not to lands or kingdoms, but to oneself. And as the first light of dawn warmed his face, he closed the book with a gentle smile, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories were those won in the quiet chambers of the heart. The evening settled softly across a small, peaceful village nestled in a valley where the hills folded gently against the horizon. Napoleon walked slowly through the winding lanes, his footsteps almost silent on the cobblestones, damp from a recent rain. The air was cool and carried the delicate scent of jasmine and freshly turned earth. The sky above was a deep indigo, sprinkled with the earliest stars that twinkled faintly like distant fires. In this final dream, he was not a conqueror, nor an exile, nor even a writer of tales. He was simply a man sitting quietly by a hearth, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, sipping warm tea as the world outside grew still. His home was humble, a small cottage with walls lined by shelves filled with books, memories, and tokens of a life not defined by grandeur, but by the gentle pulse of everyday moments. The fire crackled softly, sending dancing shadows that played on the ceiling, creating an ever-changing tapestry of light and dark. Napoleon's thoughts were calm, wandering like smoke in the quiet room. He reflected on the many lives he had imagined: gardener, clockmaker, storyteller, astronomer, each a thread in a tapestry of longing, peace, and simple joy. He thought of the people he had met in his dreams, the children's laughter in the garden, the soft ticking of repaired clocks, the silent songs of the stars, the warm voices gathered around fires. Each had taught him something precious: patience, wonder, connection, forgiveness. He reached for a small journal resting on the table and began to write slowly, his pen moving with care. "I have traveled many paths," he wrote, "but the one that leads home is always quiet. It is not marked by triumph or loss, but by the moments we choose to hold gently in our hands." He paused, listening to the whisper of the wind outside, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of morning. He thought of the past, not with regret, but with understanding. The battles fought, the dreams chased, the mistakes made, all parts of a journey that had brought him here to this place of stillness. As the night deepened, he set down his pen and looked around his simple room, the warm chair, the flickering candle, the open window framing the stars. He smiled softly, a smile without haste or burden, a smile that spoke of peace found not in conquest, but in acceptance. And as sleep beckoned, he whispered to the quiet night, "Here, at last, I rest.